Okay, guys, today we are going to be looking at indicator 4.3, and what it deals with is capitalism and entrepreneurs. Just to give you the actual indicator and what it says in our standards, is that in 4.3, you're going to evaluate the role of capitalism and its impact on democracy, including the ascent of new industries, the increasing availability of consumer goods and the rising standard of living, the role of entrepreneurs, the rise of business through monopolies, and the influence of business ideologies. I don't know, a lot of those are big words, and you might want to write down some of those words if you didn't understand them or didn't know what they mean. Just sort of jot them maybe off to the side, and you'll see it maybe at the end of the lesson. That's something you can use. So, with that being said, let's get on to indicator 4.3. Of course, we're going to start with our learning objective questions. You definitely want to write these down before the lesson begins. And here are the questions. How does capitalism thrive in the United States in the late 1800s? Explain how two famous entrepreneurs rise to power and create monopolies. Explain the difference between horizontal and vertical integration. How does the term robber baron come about? Explain the Sherman Antitrust Act and its purpose. How does big business grow? And how does big business try to change its perception? So, all of those questions are going to be addressed in this lesson. So, please make sure you write those down, pause the video for a minute, jot them down, and then move on once you have those questions written down. So, now that you've got your learning objective questions, let's look at the first topic. The first topic is going to be on capitalism and what capitalism is. And when we define capitalism, we define it as ways of making money with few limitations. So it's a free market. It's really where you let supply and demand dictate what happens within the economy. So capitalism is the type of economy that we have. The opposite of capitalism naturally would be communism, where the government pretty much controls and gets their hands involved in the economy. So capitalism is what we have in the United States. It's good. It helps us make a lot of money. We have the right to make as much money as we want. We can produce and make anything that we want. We can charge what we want and so on. That's what makes capitalism go. But it also means that the government doesn't control any part of it, that the government is pretty much staying out of it. Last year in your world history class, one of the things that you discussed was something known as laissez-faire. And the term laissez-faire means hands off. It means to keep out of or to stay out of the economy, that the government should not be involved in the economy. So again, the word laissez-faire, you need to know what it is. And then again, capitalism allows for people to own their own businesses, and in those businesses, they try to make a profit. Let's look at two famous entrepreneurs of this period. This is the late 1800s. Remember, we have discussed what went on after the Civil War. We went through Reconstruction. We talked a good bit about the railroads in Indicator 4.1. So remember, the railroads are really going to open up the United States and turn it into one big market. And these guys are going to take advantage of that time period. And we need to know what the definition is for the word entrepreneur. And an entrepreneur is someone who's willing to take a risk with their own money in order to make a profit. And these two guys pictured here are two famous entrepreneurs. Just like I just said, the railroads are going to open up these new enterprises. They're going to take advantage of these new enterprises. And of course, with all these railroads being built, someone had to make the steel, and we're going to talk about that guy in just a minute. But the two key entrepreneurs would have been Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Those two guys really took advantage of this time period with the railroads and things being shipped back and forth. All the resources needed to be moved. Railroads took advantage of that. Resources included things like steel, lumber, coal, and other things that needed to be transferred all the way across the country, back and forth, and so on. So these guys are going to take advantage of that period, and they're going to become extremely wealthy during that period. Let's talk about the first one, and that's Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie becomes known for steel production. He creates what we would call a steel monopoly. A monopoly is where you pretty much control everything within a company or business, and you don't let competition interfere. You pretty much get rid of all the competition, either by buying it or by running them out of business. And so this is one of the strategies that Andrew Carnegie is going to put into place. Steel, of course, needed to be used for the new railroads. But the problem was before steel was that the iron wasn't strong enough, and they couldn't build big buildings. They couldn't build these large expansion bridges. So Carnegie is going to take advantage of a way of producing steel a lot cheaper and making it more affordable so some of these things could be built. And that process was called the Bessemer process. And what it was it was the mass production of steel from melting pig iron. And they would put it in these furnaces, and that's how they would pretty much make it. But the Bessemer process was used. What it's going to do is it's going to make steel cheap. Before this process, steel was very expensive. After this process, it becomes cheaper. Andrew Carnegie is going to take full advantage of this, and he's going to control the steel industry. And not only is he just going to control his own company, but he's going to try to control everything from the mining of the iron ore all the way up to the actual making of the steel and the selling of the steel. So Andrew Carnegie is going to create this monopoly by controlling all aspects of the steel industry. So what Andrew Carnegie uses to do this is something known as vertical integration. Vertical integration is going to uh, take in the concept of everything that you pretty much are controlling the production and distribution of a particular product, and it creates total control over that product. That's what vertical integration is, taking over a product and its distribution and creating total control over the product. And of course, I've given you a nice little diagram over here on the left, um, so you can get an idea of some of those things that are involved. Andrew Carnegie uses this vertical integration to create his monopoly. Again, a monopoly, you control every aspect of a industry, and usually you have a lot of buyers, but there's only one person that they can buy from, and that's when you have a monopoly. Another entrepreneur that we need to discuss is John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller comes to dominate the oil industry. His his idea of actually controlling the oil industry is going to be a little different from Andrew Carnegie. The name of his company was called Standard Oil. It became the nation's first trust. And a trust is when many companies unite into one organization. And John D. Rockefeller is going to do just that. He's going to try to combine a whole bunch of companies by buying them and then putting them under the Standard Oil name. But the trust goal is to destroy your competition and to create a monopoly where he is the only seller of oil. And that's pretty much what John D. Rockefeller did, and that's how he became so rich. But his philosophy is known as horizontal integration. Horizontal integration, again, you buy all the companies that make the same product by either running them out of business or buying them one way or the other. And that's the way John D. Rockefeller operated. Some people called his practices to be corrupt. One of the things, like I just said, was he would undersell the market until he drove his competitors out by cutting prices so low to where the other competitors couldn't compete because he had tons of money. So he wasn't like he was going to go bankrupt or anything like that by taking a little bit of a loss. And then once he drove his competitors out of business, then he would increase the prices and make up for the profits that he lost. He also forced railroads to give him rebates to transport his products. And if they didn't, then he would buy his own railroad, which he actually did. And he forced retailers to sell his product. So again, these were some of the things that Rockefeller did that some people thought were pretty corrupt. Forced retailers to sell his product and only his product, not other products that were similar to his. So that's just one of the ways that he went about doing business. Again, these are diagrams of vertical and horizontal integration. Remember that vertical integration begins with raw material sources, resources, and then works its way all the way up through the complete process of making it, selling it, and producing it. So all of it is done in one swoop. Horizontal integration is where you buy a whole bunch of companies that are like you in order to drive those companies either out of business or to get rid of your competition. So that's horizontal integration. Again, horizontal, remember, these are some examples of some of those things. Warner Brothers is a production company. They own a bunch of stuff. Marketing companies like HBO, CNN, New Line Cinema, distribution company. You can see Cinemax, New Line Cinema, exhibition company, HBO, New Line Cinema, and so on. So this is sort of giving you a sort of an example of both. Now, because these guys were becoming so rich during this period, they got a special name, and that name was sort of negative. The negative name was, or nickname was, robber barons, and this is the negative nickname for industrialists who became wealthy by unethical means. They did some pretty crazy things, questionable stock market operations, and they exploited their labor forces. To try to combat this, the government eventually tries to step in with something known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. And you definitely need to know what the Sherman Antitrust Act is. So, because these consumers were concerned over these monopolies where there was only one person to buy from, they're going to put a lot of pressure on the federal government. And so, what the government does is they force Congress to pass, or what the government ends up doing, is they're going to pass something called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is going to make monopolies illegal. And even to this day, that you have to own a certain percentage of a certain type of business in order to be considered a monopoly. But the Sherman Antitrust Act was the first way to try to stop these monopolies from growing too strong and too powerful in one industry. So big business begins to grow. These robber barons began to call themselves the captains of industry because of their success. And one of the arguments that they had was they believed in social Darwinism. And of course, Charles Darwin, the theory of evolution, the survival of the fittest. Well, they're saying that this was a survival of the fittest in business, that, you know, eventually these smaller businesses should be forced out to make way for these bigger businesses to, you know, to offer more things. But social Darwinism was what these guys really practiced. They thought that you could work hard, you could move up, that only the strong shall survive. They also believed in the idea of laissez faire, that the government stays out of the economy and the government keeps its hands off of big business. The flip side of all of this was that the captains of industry also wanted protection from the government. So they're pretty much telling the government, hey, you know, stay out of this, but maybe we want you to do something um, about it. You know, maybe we want you to protect us from these unions and allow our big business to keep growing. So they're asking the government for help, but then again, they don't want the government to you know, to be a part of it. So again, they're contradicting themselves. They also asked for the government to issue tariffs. Remember, a tariff is a tax on certain products. Um, Government regulation, if it comes in, this is the opposite of laissez faire. These tariffs are taxes on products that were competition to them. They're asking the federal government to protect them from those products. So they're really contradicting themselves through asking for these things from the government. So, how is big business going to change their perception? A lot of people are viewing them at this point in a negative way. A book by Horatio Alger was written. It was called Rags to Riches, uh, basically saying that anyone in America could make it if they worked hard. Um, Andrew Carnegie is going to try to change some of his perception or the way he's viewed um, through a couple of things. Article called The Gospel of Wealth said that wealthy entrepreneurs should distribute their fortune. And of course, Carnegie's going to do that. He's going to practice philanthropy, which gave millions of dollars to libraries and universities. And hopefully, it would be for the betterment of society. Um, Rockefeller would soon follow Carnegie's lead, donating money as well. You guys have heard of Rockefeller Center. You've heard of Carnegie Hall. All of those were things that were money where money was donated for the arts. And again, these were showing some of their philanthropist ways. A philanthropist is, or philanthropy is where someone very wealthy gives money for a good cause or for a good charity. Even though they're extremely rich, they're willing to give money. So that's pretty much what a philanthropist does. Again, this is how many people viewed big business. You can see all the trust and of course, Standard Oil's up there too. You can see it. So this is how people were viewing these guys during this period. Wasn't a pretty picture for these guys, but they made tons and tons of money. And some of that money's still around even to this day. So that is going to do it for 4.3. But before you finish this up, there, of course, answer those learning objective questions. But also, I want you to reflect on what you just heard and listened to and written down. I want you to answer these questions. What is one thing that you learned from this lesson that maybe you didn't know before? Um, the other thing is, what words in this lesson were you unfamiliar with, even from the beginning all the way through the end? Any term or thing that you did not know, please jot those things down. What is one thing that you have a question about or would like to know more about? Is the next one. And then the last one is I want you to pick one topic, event, person, or whatever it is out of this lesson. I want you to research a little bit of information about it and find me something that was not in this lesson that you found interesting, and make sure you include it on your note sheet. And we're going to share some of those things with the class after everybody gets done with the notes. Okay? All right, that's going to do it for 4.3. Make sure that you've done the reflection. Make sure you've done the learning objective questions. They're both answered. And then make sure you bring these things up so you can get checked off when you have finished. All right, I will catch you guys on the next one. And hopefully you understand everything. If you didn't, please, please, please feel free to ask any questions once you're done. All right, that's going to do it for 4.3.